Imagine sitting in a freezing courtroom, surrounded by flashing cameras, and the person actively trying to destroy your life is your own father. He looks the jury dead in the eye and swears you are a pathological liar, a fraud who fabricated an entire military career just to steal the family fortune. He wants to strip away your inheritance, your freedom, and your dignity. And you have to sit there, completely silent, trapped by a classified military oath you swore to protect. The judge raises his gavel, ready to finalize your absolute ruin and hand your father everything. But right before the gavel falls, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom burst open. What happens next didn't just shatter my toxic family's empire, it completely broke the internet. This story reveals the incredible power of maintaining your silent discipline when narcissists try to break your spirit. It proves that true validation doesn't come from toxic bloodlines. It comes from the undeniable truth of your own sacrifices and integrity. If you've ever had to fight to protect your peace from the very people who were supposed to love you the most, hit that like button to stand with us. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice, and share your own victory in the comments below. Your story might be the exact survival guide another woman needs today. The air inside the Manhattan courtroom was heavy. It smelled of lemon polish and expensive cologne. I sat at the defendant's table. My hands were folded tightly in my lap. I wore a tailored navy suit. I chose it specifically to look as civilian as possible. Across the aisle, my father, Arthur Sterling, adjusted his tie. He stepped up to the witness stand. He looked like the perfect patriarch. His silver hair caught the light. His bespoke charcoal suit practically screamed old money. He placed his hand on the railing. He looked directly at the jury, and then he began to cry. It was a masterclass in manipulation. "She is a fraud," my father said. His voice cracked with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. "My daughter never served a day in her life. She is using a fake uniform to steal her grandfather's legacy. It breaks my heart to say this, but she is entirely delusional." I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was not panic. It was a deep, aching grief. I had survived shrapnel. I had survived gunfire in the darkest, most unforgiving corners of the world. But the deepest wound I ever received was happening right here. It was delivered by my own flesh and blood. It was happening in a climate-controlled room in front of 12 strangers. I looked at the gallery. My mother, Margaret, sat in the front row. She was dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She was paralyzed by my father's control. She was silently watching her youngest daughter be crucified. Next to her sat my older sister, Eleanor. Eleanor held her phone low in her lap. I knew she was recording audio. She would use this mental health crisis to get sympathy from her millions of followers. It was sick. It was a perfectly orchestrated high society execution. 10 years ago, I walked away from the Sterling family. I walked away from their suffocating, conditional love. I did not want a life of country club galas. I did not want to be a chess piece in my father's corporate mergers. I wanted a purpose. So I enlisted. I traded my trust fund for a one-way ticket to basic training. My father never forgave me for leaving his kingdom. To him, I was not a daughter. I was a lost asset. But this trial was not about a bruised ego. It was about survival. His survival. My grandfather, the true founder of the Sterling Empire, had left behind a massive trust fund. It was worth tens of millions. But the trust had a strict morality clause. The heir had to possess unimpeachable moral character. My father's investment bank was failing. He was drowning in hidden debts. He needed my inheritance to save himself. So he fabricated this lawsuit. He was suing me in civil court. He wanted a judge to declare me legally fraudulent and mentally unfit. He was accusing me of stolen valor. If he could prove I lied about my military service, the money would default back to his control. She bought those medals online. My father continued. He pointed a trembling finger at me. She wears them to mock the real heroes. I tried to get her psychiatric help. I tried to save her, but she is too far gone. Sarah Jenkins, my defense attorney, scribbled furiously on her legal pad. She leaned toward me. "We need to object," she whispered. "He is destroying your character." "Let him speak," I replied softly. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking under the table. I was not a cold, emotionless machine. Every lie he told felt like a physical blow. I had sacrificed my youth. I had sacrificed my safety. I had bled for my country in operations that did not exist on any public record. I was an intelligence officer in a black ops unit. My entire career was classified. I could not defend myself without breaking federal law. My father knew this. He had hired a team of ruthless corporate lawyers to exploit my silence. They were using my oath of loyalty against me. The jury looked at me with absolute disgust. I was the spoiled heiress who dressed up as a soldier for attention. That was the narrative. It was clean. It was believable. It fit perfectly into their view of the wealthy elite. My father stepped down from the stand. He gave me a quick, cold glance. There was no love in his eyes. There was only calculation. He was measuring the value of his victory. He thought he had me completely cornered. He thought I was still the quiet, obedient girl he used to control. He was wrong. I was not a victim waiting to be rescued. I was a strategist. I had spent 10 years operating in the shadows. I knew how to wait for the enemy to overextend their lines. The trial was only just beginning, and Arthur Sterling had no idea what kind of war he had just started. The second day of the trial began with a brutal offensive. My father's legal team was not pulling any punches. They called their next witness to the stand. His name was David Vance, just a discharged veteran with a grudge. He wore a faded suit. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from side to side. My father's lead attorney, a slick man with a shark-like smile, approached the witness box. "Mr. Vance, can you describe your interactions with the defendant?" the lawyer asked. His voice echoed in the silent courtroom. "She was a desk clerk," David said. He purposely avoided my gaze. "We were stationed at the same domestic base. She filed papers. She ordered supplies. She never deployed. She definitely never saw combat." A low murmur ran through the gallery. Eleanor typed furiously on her phone. I could practically read her next post in my head. My sister was monetizing my destruction in real time. Sarah, my lawyer, gripped her pen so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked at me with sheer panic. We were losing the narrative. The jury was writing me off as a pathological liar. "Clara, this is extremely bad," Sarah whispered. Her voice was tight with anxiety. "If we do not present concrete evidence soon, he will win. The judge will freeze your assets by tomorrow." I took a slow, deep breath. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. It was the same metallic taste I got before a night raid. I reached into my briefcase. I pulled out a plain manila folder. I slid it across the polished oak table toward Sarah. She looked down at it, entirely confused. "What is this?" she asked. "Useful evidence," I said calmly. I had a private investigator look into Mr. Vance's sudden willingness to testify. Turn to page 3. Look at the bank records. Sarah opened the folder. Her eyes widened. She quickly flipped through the pages. The documents contained geolocation data and offshore banking transfers. The data showed that David Vance had received a sudden, anonymous wire transfer of $50,000 just 2 weeks before the trial. The money had bounced through 3 shell companies, but the final trace led directly to a holding company owned by Arthur Sterling. Sarah stood up. She did not hesitate. She cross-examined the witness with surgical precision. She presented the financial records to the court. She asked David Vance why his phone's GPS showed him at my father's country club 3 days before the wire transfer. The witness crumbled. He stammered, looked at my father for help, and finally fell silent. The judge was furious. He struck the testimony from the record immediately. I looked across the room. My father's face was pale. The mask had slipped. Just for a second. He gripped the edge of his table. His knuckles were bone white. For the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling realized I could fight back. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous. My father's lawyer quickly changed tactics. He stood up, smoothing his expensive tie. "Your Honor," the lawyer said smoothly. "We expected the defendant to try and distract this court. But we have one final piece of evidence. We subpoenaed the Department of Defense. We requested Clara Sterling's complete military service record." My heart skipped a beat. This was the moment I had dreaded. The lawyer held up a thick stack of papers. He walked over and handed it to the judge. Then he turned to the jury with a theatrical sigh. The government complied. The lawyer continued. His voice was dripping with smug satisfaction. But as you can see, the file is completely empty. Almost every single page is entirely blacked out. The military has no unclassified record of her so-called heroism. She is a ghost. And she is a ghost because her career is a complete and utter lie. The courtroom was dead silent. The trap had finally closed around me. They were using federal classification laws to erase my existence. I could not speak about my missions in Eastern Europe. I could not speak about the men I had saved. If I opened my mouth, I would face federal treason charges. I would be trading my inheritance for a prison cell. Sarah sank back into her chair. She looked completely defeated. I cannot fight a blacked-out piece of paper. Clara, she whispered, we are out of options. You have to settle. I looked at my mother, who was staring at the floor. I looked at my sister, who was trying to hide a triumphant smile. And then I looked at my father. He was watching me with cold, calculating eyes. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for me to beg. I sat up perfectly straight. I adjusted the cuffs of my jacket. I did not feel fear. I felt an absolute, freezing determination. They thought my silence was a weakness. They thought the shadows would bury me. They were wrong. I had one final move left on the board. And I was about to burn their entire empire to the ground. The morning of the third day brought a suffocating stillness to the courtroom, against Sarah's frantic warnings. I made the decision to take the witness stand. As I walked up the steps, the clicks of the press cameras echoed like distant firecrackers. I adjusted the lapels of my civilian jacket, keeping my posture completely straight, a habit drilled into my spine through a decade of military discipline. I looked out at the gallery. My sister Eleanor was adjusting the ring light attached to her phone, whispering into her microphone, continuing to spin her web of lies for her online audience. My mother sat beside her, eyes fixed on her lap, a masterclass in silent complicity. And my father, Arthur Sterling, sat at the plaintiff's table, smug, victorious smile playing on his lips. He truly believed he had won. He believed the blacked-out military file had buried me forever. The Sterling family's lead attorney approached the witness stand with the slow, predatory grace of a man who thought the kill was already secured. He leaned against the wooden railing, looking down at me with an expression of patronizing pity. Miss Sterling, he began, his voice dripping with false empathy. We all understand the desire to be special. We understand the need to feel important, especially in a family as highly accomplished as the Sterlings. But the United States military has provided a file that is nothing but black lines and empty spaces. There is no public record of your deployment. There are no names, no dates, no locations. So I will ask you plainly, before this jury, if you truly serve this nation as a high-ranking officer, tell us where you were. Give us the coordinates. Give us the names of the operations. Prove to this court that you are not just a deeply disturbed young woman hiding behind a stolen identity. A heavy silence settled over the room. Sarah looked at me from the defense table. Her breath hitched, terrified that I would break and violate federal classification laws. I looked past the attorney and locked eyes with my father. I felt the weight of his emotional abuse. The years of being told I was nothing but a line item on his financial ledger. A disappointment because I chose a path of service over a life of corporate manipulation. But I did not flinch. I let my breath out slowly, letting my voice drop into a calm, steady register that commanded the entire room. I cannot give you coordinates, and I will not give you names, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. Because right now, at this very moment, there are men and women operating in dangerous territories whose lives depend on those secrets remaining in the dark. I took an oath to protect this nation, and that means protecting the people who stand on the front lines. My father believes that everything in this world can be bought, sold, or negotiated. He believes that because my service cannot be displayed on a country club wall or posted for likes on social media, it doesn't exist. But true service isn't about glory. It isn't about a multi-million-dollar trust fund. It is about the heavy, silent burden of doing what is right when no one is watching. The prosecutor laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. A beautiful speech, Ms. Sterling, but speeches are not evidence. In a court of law, we require documentation. And right now, your record is a ghost. You are asking this jury to believe a fantasy. I am asking this court to understand the law, I countered, leaning forward. My father thought he could use my classified status as a weapon to strip away my inheritance and my dignity. He assumed I would sit here in silence and let him rewrite my history. But he forgot one crucial detail. A field operator never enters a conflict without a contingency plan. I turned to the judge, my expression turning entirely serious. Your Honor. 3 weeks ago, utilizing the Military Whistleblower Protection Act and my own high-level security clearance, I formally petitioned the Department of Defense for an expedited declassification review of a specific commendation. My father's legal team subpoenaed a general record, which automatically triggered standard security redactions. But I requested a targeted exception for a single, unredacted entry regarding a matter of national security that has recently been cleared for public record. I submit to this court that the verified, certified documentation is arriving today. My father's smile instantly vanished. He leaned forward, whispering frantically to his co-counsel. The prosecutor's face hardened as he realized that my weeks of silence were not a sign of defeat, but the quiet preparation of a devastating counteroffensive. I stepped down from the stand and returned to my seat. The game of shadows was over. The trap was set, and the Sterlings had walked right into it. The prosecution began their closing arguments just after lunch, their tone noticeably more desperate. The slick corporate lawyer tried his best to minimize my testimony, painting it as the desperate final stand of a pathological liar. But the energy in the courtroom had completely shifted. The jurors were no longer looking at me with absolute disgust. Instead, a palpable sense of curiosity and tension filled the air. Sarah sat next to me, her knee bouncing nervously under the table. Clara, if this documentation doesn't arrive before the judge calls for the final verdict, we are finished, she whispered, her hands trembling over her legal pad. We are out of time. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open with violent force. The sudden noise cut the prosecutor off mid-sentence. Every single head in the gallery turned toward the entrance. The bailiff instinctively reached for his belt, but stopped dead in his tracks. The frantic murmuring of the press corps died in an instant, replaced by the sharp, rhythmic, and incredibly precise clack of polished dress shoes striking the marble floor. The sound was unmistakably military measured, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. General Thomas Vance strode down the center aisle. He wore his full dress uniform, a dark blue jacket adorned with gleaming gold braid across the shoulder boards. 4 heavy, polished silver stars gleamed on each of his shoulders, radiating the absolute authority of a man who answered only to the commander-in-chief. His chest was a formidable wall of multicolored service ribbons, representing decades of combat operations in territories most civilians couldn't find on a map. His jaw was set like granite, his piercing gray eyes locked entirely on the judge's bench. He walked straight past my father's table without offering even a glance. He ignored my sister Eleanor, whose phone had dropped onto her lap, her mouth completely agape. He ignored my mother, who sat frozen, her silk handkerchief suspended in midair. The general stopped exactly 3 feet from the judge's platform, bringing his heels together with a clean, echoing snap. Your Honor. His commanding voice boomed through the silent room. I am General Thomas Vance. I request immediate permission to address this court regarding a matter of certified military record and national security. The judge stared at the 4 stars on the general's shoulders, completely stunned. He slowly removed his reading glasses, nodded once, and granted the request. My father's attorney tried to stand and object, but the judge silenced him with a single, sharp raised finger. General Vance stepped into the witness box, completely bypassing standard protocol. He placed his large hands on the wooden railing and looked directly at the jury, his voice cutting through the courtroom like an artillery shell. I am here today to present the officially declassified Silver Star citation for Colonel Clara Sterling. 10 years ago, my unit was ambushed in an unclassified conflict zone in Eastern Europe. Our transport vehicle was struck by an explosive device. I was severely wounded, bleeding out, and trapped beneath scorched metal. The chain of command had collapsed. The general paused, his eyes shifting to me, filled with a profound, hard-earned respect. Colonel Sterling did not hesitate. Under heavy, continuous enemy fire, she single-handedly established a defensive perimeter, directed suppressive fire, and pulled 3 wounded men out of the burning wreckage, including myself. She applied life-saving medical aid with one hand while returning fire with the other. Her actions saved my life and the lives of my entire unit. The courtroom completely lost its oxygen. I watched the 12 jurors physically recoil in their seats, their faces filled with utter shock. Sarah's pen dropped onto the floor, rolling under the table, completely forgotten, across the aisle. My father's face completely drained of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned purple. His fragile reality shattering in front of the very media cameras he had hired to destroy me. Impossible, my father barked, his voice cracking with desperate panic. You are covering for her. This girl could never be a military commander. Beside him, Eleanor leaped to her feet, her carefully crafted image of internet composure completely disintegrating into an undignified shriek. It's a lie. She's a nobody. The judge slammed his gavel 3 times, the loud bangs echoing like thunder. Silence, he roared, pointing at the bailiff. Control your clients or they will be removed immediately. General Vance completely ignored their pathetic outbursts. He stepped down from the witness box, his dress shoes striking the floor with lethal cadence. He turned his body squarely toward my table, straightened his spine to its full height, and raised his right hand in a flawless, razor-sharp military salute. Colonel Sterling, the 4-star general said, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. This nation owes you a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid. I stood up, my spine rigid, my shoulders squared. I raised my hand and returned the salute, the tears finally welling in my eyes. They were not tears of weakness, but of the sheer, crushing weight of finally being seen. In that singular moment, my father's corporate wealth and my sister's fake internet fame were reduced to absolute garbage beneath my boots. True justice had arrived. The silence in the courtroom following General Vance's salute was absolute, heavy and completely breathtaking. For a moment, time seemed to stand entirely still, suspended in the space between my raised hand and the general's unwavering gaze. The 12 jurors sat perfectly frozen, their previous judgments completely washed away by the undeniable weight of the truth. When the general finally lowered his hand, he turned back to the judge, handed over the heavily sealed, declassified dossier containing the official Silver Star citation, and walked back down the center aisle. He did not spare a single glance for my father, Arthur Sterling, who was currently gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table, as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. The sharp clack of the general's polished dress shoes faded into the corridor, leaving behind a courtroom that had been fundamentally and irrevocably transformed. The judge adjusted his reading glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he broke the official seal on the dossier. He spent several agonizing minutes reading the documentation in complete silence. The only sound in the room was the frantic clicking of the court reporter's stenotype machine and the ragged, shallow breathing of my sister Eleanor, who was staring in absolute horror at her phone screen. Her live stream had captured every single second of the general's testimony. The chat on her screen, previously filled with supporters calling for my imprisonment, was now a scrolling blur of outrage directed entirely at her and our father. Her internet empire, built on a foundation of manufactured drama and pathological lies, was burning to the ground in real time. Finally, the judge removed his glasses and looked down at my father with an expression of unadulterated disgust. Mr. Sterling, the judge began, his voice echoing with absolute authority. In my 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed such a repulsive, calculated, and malicious abuse of the judicial system. You brought your own daughter into this courtroom with the explicit intention of destroying her life, her reputation, and her dignity, all to fraudulently seize a trust fund you have absolutely no moral right to possess. You paraded paid witnesses. You orchestrated a smear campaign. You attempted to weaponize a military officer's classified oath of silence for your own financial gain. My father opened his mouth to speak, to offer some corporate excuse. But the judge slammed his gavel down with explosive force. You will remain silent. The judge roared. This case is dismissed with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am directing the district attorney's office to open an immediate investigation into you, Arthur Sterling, for severe perjury, witness tampering, and criminal fraud. Your assets will be frozen pending this federal investigation. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time, sounding like a coffin lid slamming shut on the Sterling family dynasty. Sarah, my attorney, threw her arms around me, weeping tears of pure relief and hard-earned victory. But I did not cry. I packed my legal pad into my briefcase with slow, deliberate precision. I turned and walked down the aisle, stepping past my mother, who was sobbing into her hands, finally realizing that her silence had cost her a daughter forever. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out onto the granite steps of the courthouse, instantly swallowed by a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Footsteps hurried up behind me, frantic and entirely lacking in discipline. Clara, Clara, wait, it was my father. He pushed his way through the press, forcing a sickeningly fake, patriarchal smile for the surrounding cameras. He reached out and grabbed my shoulder, leaning in to whisper in my ear while trying to project an image of a proud, reconciling father for the evening news. We can fix this, he hissed frantically. The bank needs that money, Clara. You made your point. We are family. You have to save me. I did not let him finish his pathetic script. I brought my arm up and broke his grip with a sharp, practiced block, stepping fully into his personal space. The cameras captured his humiliated flinch as his corporate mask completely shattered. You never wanted a daughter, Arthur, I said, my voice cold, flat and carrying a lethal finality. You wanted a possession. You wanted an asset to control. You tried to bury me in the dark. But you forgot that I learned how to see in the dark a long time ago. I am keeping my grandfather's legacy, and I am finally free of yours. I turned my back on him, walking down the steps toward the waiting car. I did not look back, leaving him surrounded by the very media vultures he had hired to consume me, now fully prepared to tear him apart. The drive away from the courthouse was the quietest, most profoundly peaceful journey of my entire life. As I rolled down the window, letting the cool city breeze wash over my face, I realized that the heavy armor I had worn for the past 10 years was finally beginning to crack, letting the light in. For so long, I had believed that blood was the only thing that truly defined a family. I had let their impossible expectations shrink my spirit, and I had allowed their cruelty to convince me, in my darkest moments, that I was inherently hard to love. But as the city skyline faded in the rearview mirror, I understood a truth that no courtroom could ever legislate and no trust fund could ever buy. We are not defined by the toxic environments we are born into. We are not obligated to set ourselves on fire just to keep our abusers warm. For years, society has conditioned women to be the peacekeepers, to swallow our pride, to hide our strength, and to forgive the unforgivable in the name of keeping the family unit intact. But true family is never built on a foundation of control, manipulation, and conditional love. True family is about shared respect. It is about the people who hold the line for you when the entire world is firing at you. My real family was not the people sitting in that courtroom trying to strip away my dignity. My real family was the men and women who bled beside me in the dirt, the people who valued my life over their own. To every woman listening to this story right now, whether you are 35 or 65, whether you are fighting a battle in a corporate boardroom, inside a courtroom, or in the quiet, lonely confines of your own living room. You need to hear this clearly. Your worth is not up for negotiation. No one, absolutely no one, has the right to rewrite your history, diminish your sacrifices, or tell you that you are crazy for demanding basic human respect. The narcissists in your life will always try to use your silence as proof of their lies. They will gaslight you. They will isolate you. And they will try to make you believe that walking away is an act of betrayal. But walking away from abuse is not a betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. The path to true healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding you. Equality and human rights do not just exist in the Constitution. They must exist at your own dinner table. If you are not respected in your own home, if you are treated as a commodity rather than a human being, you have every right to build a new table. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to protect your peace with the ferocity of a soldier defending the front lines. Your truth is your armor, and your integrity is your most valuable asset. If my journey resonated with you today, if you have ever had to fight tooth and nail to protect your own truth from the people who were supposed to love you the most, please leave a comment below and share your story. You are not alone in this fight. Hit the like button to help this message reach another woman who might desperately need to hear it today. And please subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, justice, and profound emotional healing. And a final warning before we part ways today. When you finally decide to stand up and speak your truth, the toxic people in your life will call you the villain. Let them. Let them spin their narratives and let them cry their fake tears. Because at the end of the day, a villain with peace in her heart is far more powerful than a victim trapped in a lie. Wear your armor proudly. Defend your perimeter. And never, ever forget your own incredible worth. Until next time, stay strong and keep fighting for the life you truly deserve. The weeks following the trial were a masterclass in the absolute destruction of a corrupt empire, the media, which my sister Eleanor had so eagerly weaponized against me, completely turned its ravenous appetite toward the Sterling family. The federal investigation initiated by the judge was swift, brutal, and entirely unsparing. Agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission raided my father's pristine investment bank within 48 hours of the verdict. They carried out boxes of hard drives and financial ledgers, uncovering a labyrinth of hidden debts, offshore accounts, and fraudulent collateral that spanned over a decade. Arthur Sterling, the man who had tried to bury his own daughter to save his fortune, was indicted on 17 counts of federal fraud and witness tampering. The charcoal suits and designer cufflinks were replaced by the harsh reality of a federal holding facility. His wealthy country club friends, the same people who had signed false affidavits condemning my character, vanished into thin air, scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of his sinking ship. Eleanor's downfall was equally spectacular, playing out entirely in the digital arena she had once ruled. Her sponsors dropped her within hours of the courtroom livestream. The teeth-whitening companies, the luxury skincare brands, and the fashion labels all issued public statements severing ties, citing a zero-tolerance policy for perjury and family abuse. Her follower count plummeted by the hundreds of thousands. In a desperate attempt to salvage her brand, she posted a tearful apology video, sitting on her bedroom floor without makeup, claiming our father had manipulated her into lying. But the internet is a merciless judge, and the comment section tore her apart. They saw through the mechanical tears and the practiced breathing. She had shown the world her true face in that courtroom, and no amount of ring lighting could ever soften the jagged edges of her cruelty. She was forced to sell her Manhattan penthouse and retreat into complete obscurity, silenced by the very platform she had used to try and destroy my life. As for my mother, Margaret, she remained exactly where she had always been, frozen in the background, a silent casualty of her own complicity. With my father's assets frozen and the family estate seized by creditors, she moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. She sent me one letter. It was written on cheap, unlined paper, a far cry from the embossed silk stationery she used to favor. She wrote about how much she missed me, how she had always known I was a hero, and how she hoped we could rebuild our relationship. I read the letter standing in my kitchen. I did not feel anger, nor did I feel sadness. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of distance. I folded the paper in half and dropped it into the shredder. You cannot rebuild a bridge that was fundamentally designed to collapse under your own weight. With the legal battle definitively won, the control of my grandfather's multi-million-dollar trust fund was legally transferred into my name. But I had no interest in hoarding wealth or returning to the suffocating high society circles that had bred such toxic greed. I had walked away from that life 10 years ago, and I was not going back. Instead, I established the Sterling Vanguard Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated entirely to supporting female veterans transitioning back into civilian life. We focused on providing comprehensive legal defense for women facing domestic abuse, funding specialized trauma therapy for severe PTSD, and offering financial grants for female veterans starting their own independent businesses. I took the very money my father had tried to steal and turned it into a weapon of mass empowerment for women who had been broken, silenced, or cast aside by the people who were supposed to protect them. Walking through the doors of the Foundation's headquarters for the first time was a profoundly healing experience. The walls were not lined with oil paintings of wealthy patriarchs, but with photographs of strong, resilient women who had fought for their country and were now fighting for their own peace. I sat in circle therapy sessions, listening to women share stories that echoed my own, stories of betrayal, of surviving toxic family dynamics, and of the agonizing guilt that comes with finally setting hard boundaries. I looked into their eyes and saw the same fear and defiance I had carried into that courtroom, but here in this safe space. We were not victims waiting for a judge to validate our existence. We were a specialized unit of survivors, teaching each other how to navigate the civilian world with the same tactical precision we had used on the battlefield. The trust fund was no longer a chain tying me to a toxic legacy. It was a shield protecting the most vulnerable members of my true family. 1 year later, the chaos of the trial felt like a distant, fading storm. I had moved out of the city, purchasing a small, quiet cabin nestled in the rugged mountains of the Pacific Northwest. It was a place where the air was thin and sharp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth rather than the suffocating exhaust and expensive perfumes of Manhattan. The silence here was different from the silence in the courtroom. That silence had been a weapon, held tight against the chest to prevent a lethal strike. This silence was expansive, healing, and completely my own. I spent my mornings hiking the steep, unforgiving trails, pushing my body against the incline, feeling the strong, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. It was a daily reminder that I was alive, that I was free, and that the only person who dictated the direction of my footsteps was me. It was on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October that my secure phone buzzed against the wooden kitchen table. It was a direct call from Sarah Jenkins, my former attorney who now sat on the board of directors for my Veterans Foundation. She was calling to inform me that my father had officially been sentenced. The federal judge had shown absolutely no leniency, handing down a 15-year sentence in a minimum security federal penitentiary. Arthur Sterling, the man who had believed he could purchase the laws of physics, had finally met a system that his checkbook could not manipulate. Sarah told me that during the sentencing, he had looked around the gallery, frantically searching for a friendly face, a loyal colleague, or a forgiving daughter. He found absolutely no one. He stood entirely alone in the very room where he had tried to orchestrate my public execution. I thanked Sarah for the update, hung up the phone, and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I walked out onto the wooden deck of my cabin, looking out over the endless sea of evergreen trees stretching toward the horizon. I expected to feel a surge of vindictive triumph, a rush of adrenaline at the definitive defeat of my greatest adversary. But all I felt was a profound, settling peace. The war was officially over. I did not need to celebrate his destruction because his destruction had nothing to do with my fundamental value. My father's choices had led him into a cage of his own making. My choices, my integrity, and my unwavering commitment to my own truth had led me into the wide-open expanse of this mountain wilderness. I raised my coffee mug to the horizon, a silent, solitary toast to the incredible power of walking away. The journey of healing from profound family trauma is never a straight line. It is a rugged, uneven terrain filled with unexpected triggers and sudden waves of grief for the family you deserved but never actually had. There are days when the phantom pain of that betrayal still aches in the center of my chest. But I have learned that this pain is not a sign of weakness. It is the scar tissue of a heart that refused to be permanently broken. It is the physical evidence that I survived the extraction. Every time I counsel a young female veteran at the foundation, every time I help a woman draft a restraining order against an abusive partner, and every time I look into the mirror and recognize the fierce, unyielding woman staring back at me, I know that the brutal battle was entirely worth it. We are conditioned by society to forgive our abusers simply because they share our bloodline. We are told to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, and to accept breadcrumbs of affection in exchange for our absolute loyalty. But true peace cannot exist in an environment where your fundamental human rights, your dignity, and your boundaries are constantly under siege. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. If your family requires you to shrink yourself, to silence your truth, or to tolerate systemic disrespect in order to earn their love, then that love is a toxic transaction. You have the sovereign right to break that contract. You have the right to declare your own independence, to fortify your emotional perimeter, and to build a beautiful, thriving life far away from the people who tried to bury you in the dark. You are the sole commander of your own destiny. You do not need a 4-star general to validate your worth, and you do not need a federal judge to declare your freedom. Your freedom is an inherent human right, forged in the quiet, disciplined moments when you decide that you will no longer tolerate the unacceptable. Stand tall in your truth. Wear your scars as medals of honor. And never forget that the most powerful weapon you possess against those who seek to destroy you is your own undeniable, magnificent existence. The ultimate mission is complete. The perimeter is entirely secure. And the rest of your beautiful life is finally yours to command. The Sterling Vanguard Foundation grew from a quiet initiative into a formidable national sanctuary within 3 years. We had outgrown our original modest office space, relocating to a sprawling, sunlit building in the heart of the city. The architecture was deliberately designed to reflect transparency and safety. There were no heavy, intimidating mahogany doors or shadowy corridors like the ones that had defined my father's corporate empire. Instead, we had walls of reinforced glass, open collaborative spaces, and a central courtyard filled with resilient, thriving greenery. It was a fortress built not to keep the world out, but to fiercely protect the women healing within it. Every morning, I walked through those glass doors and felt the profound weight of my true legacy. I was no longer just a survivor of the Sterling family. I was the architect of a vanguard, deploying resources to fight battles that most of society preferred to actively ignore. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, my assistant ushered a woman named Evelyn Hayes into my office. Evelyn was 58 years old, a former combat medic who had served multiple tours during the Gulf War. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid, her hands tightly clasping a worn leather purse on her lap. Her eyes darted around the room, carrying that unmistakable, hyper-vigilant glint of a woman who had been systematically conditioned to expect an ambush at any moment. I recognized that look instantly. It was the exact same heavy, invisible armor I had worn when I first walked into Sarah Jenkins' law office all those years ago. I poured 2 cups of hot chamomile tea, walked around my heavy oak desk, and sat in the armchair directly across from her, completely removing any physical barriers between us. Evelyn's story was a tragic, infuriating echo of the systemic abuse we fought every single day. After surviving the horrors of a combat zone, she had returned home only to step into a different kind of war zone. Her husband of 30 years, a charismatic and deeply manipulative man named Richard, had spent decades isolating her, He had systematically eroded her confidence, convinced her friends that she was suffering from severe, unmanageable PTSD, and taken complete control of their finances. Now, after she had finally found the courage to file for divorce, Richard was executing a ruthless legal campaign to utterly destroy her. He had hired a team of aggressive, high-priced attorneys to petition the court for permanent spousal support, demanding total control of Evelyn's hard-earned military pension and the immediate sale of her generational family home. His legal strategy was built entirely on a fabricated narrative that Evelyn was mentally incompetent and dangerously unstable. As Evelyn spoke, her voice trembled, breaking under the crushing weight of decades of gaslighting. "He told the judge that my service ruined my mind," she whispered, a single tear slipping down her weathered cheek. "He told everyone that I am a danger to myself. I fought for my country. Clara, I saved lives in the desert. But when I sit in that courtroom, looking at his lawyers, I feel like I am absolutely nothing. I feel like the crazy woman he tells everyone I am. He has all the money, all the connections, and all the power. I do not have the strength to fight a war on my own front porch." She looked down at her hands, her spirit visibly fracturing under the immense pressure of a man who was using her honorable service as a weapon to strip away her basic human dignity. I leaned forward and gently placed my hand over hers, halting her nervous trembling. "You are not fighting this war alone, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping into that familiar, commanding tactical register. "Richard is using the exact same playbook my father used against me. Narcissists always rely on the illusion of overwhelming power. They isolate you, they drain your resources, and they weaponize your own honor because they possess absolutely none of their own. They want you to believe that your situation is hopeless, so that you will surrender before the real battle even begins." But Richard made one catastrophic miscalculation. I looked deeply into her eyes, making sure she absorbed every single word. "He assumed you had no backup. He assumed you were a lone target. But you just walked into a fortress funded by a woman who takes profound pleasure in dismantling abusive empires. We are going to deploy the best legal defense team in the country. We are going to audit every single hidden bank account he possesses. And we are going to scorch his fabricated narrative to ash over the next 6 weeks." The foundation mobilized around Evelyn with devastating efficiency. Sarah Jenkins, who now served as our lead general counsel, took the case personally. We did not merely prepare a defensive strategy. We launched a full-scale tactical offensive. We hired elite forensic accountants who quickly uncovered that Richard had been siphoning marital funds into hidden offshore accounts for over a decade. We secured sworn affidavits from Evelyn's former commanding officers and current medical providers, unequivocally proving her mental acuity and exposing Richard's claims as malicious perjury. I spent hours sitting with Evelyn in our therapeutic suites, helping her practice her testimony, teaching her how to control her breathing, and reminding her that her absolute silence in the face of his provocations was not a surrender, but a lethal weapon. We were not just preparing to win a lawsuit. We were rebuilding a soldier. The day of Evelyn's final arbitration hearing arrived with a biting chill in the air. But the atmosphere inside the conference room was electric with anticipation. I sat directly beside Evelyn at the polished mahogany table, my presence a silent, immovable barrier between her and the man who had tormented her for 3 decades. Richard sat across from us, wearing a tailored suit and a smirk that barely concealed his underlying panic. His high-priced attorneys had spent the last month desperately trying to suppress the forensic accounting reports we had filed. But the mediator, a stern retired judge, had accepted every single piece of our evidence. As Sarah Jenkins methodically presented the indisputable proof of Richard's financial fraud and calculated emotional abuse, I watched the arrogant facade melt right off his face. The predator was finally caught in a trap he could not manipulate, bribe, or charm his way out of. When the mediator delivered the final ruling, it was an absolute, unequivocal victory. Richard was not only denied any claim to Evelyn's military pension, but he was ordered to immediately forfeit his hidden assets to repay the funds he had stolen from their joint accounts. Furthermore, Evelyn was granted exclusive, permanent ownership of her family home, as the mediator slammed his sand folder shut, declaring the proceedings finalized. Richard stood up, his face flushed with humiliated rage. He glared at Evelyn, opening his mouth to deliver one last venomous insult. But Evelyn did not shrink. She did not look away. She stood up, her spine perfectly straight, her shoulders squared, and looked at him with an expression of absolute, freezing indifference. She had finally realized that he was not a monster to be feared. He was simply a pathetic, broken man holding an empty gun. She turned her back on him and walked out of the room, leaving him to choke on his own toxic defeat. That evening, we celebrated in the quiet sanctuary of the Foundation's courtyard. Evelyn held a glass of sparkling cider, her face glowing with a profound, radiant peace that made her look 10 years younger. She hugged me tightly, her tears soaking into the shoulder of my blazer. "You gave me my life back, Clara," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the courage to finally open my eyes." I hugged her back, feeling the solid, undeniable truth of her words. But I knew the reality. I hadn't given her anything she didn't already possess. I had simply provided the tactical cover fire she needed to advance on her own position. Watching Evelyn walk out of those glass doors, finally free to live the rest of her life on her own terms, I felt a deep, resonant closure regarding my own past. My father, Arthur Sterling, was still sitting in a federal prison cell, his empire reduced to dust. But he no longer occupied a single inch of territory in my mind. To the woman who is listening to this right now, the woman who might be sitting in her car or standing in her kitchen, feeling the crushing weight of a relationship or a family dynamic that is slowly erasing her soul, I need you to listen to me very carefully. It does not matter if you are 35, 50, or 65 years old. It is never, ever too late to rewrite the ending of your own story. Society often tries to convince older women that their time for reinvention has passed, that they must simply endure the beds they have made, and that choosing themselves is a selfish act of destruction. That is a manipulative lie designed to keep you compliant. Your life is your sovereign territory. You owe absolute loyalty to no one who demands your dignity as the price of admission. Healing from systemic emotional abuse and family betrayal requires the courage to become the villain in their manufactured narrative. You must be willing to let them misunderstand you. You must be willing to let them call you cold, ungrateful, or crazy. Their desperation to label you is simply proof that they can no longer control you. The moment you stop engaging in their psychological warfare, the moment you realize that you do not have to attend every argument you are invited to, you reclaim your ultimate power. True peace is found in the quiet, disciplined enforcement of your own boundaries. It is found when you realize that your chosen family, the people who celebrate your strength rather than exploit your weaknesses, are waiting for you on the other side of your fear. Your sacrifices matter. Your pain is valid. But your future is a blank canvas that belongs entirely to you. You are allowed to pack your bags in the middle of the night. You are allowed to hire the ruthless lawyer. You are allowed to walk away from the Thanksgiving table and never, ever return. Do not wait for a savior to grant you permission to live. You are the vanguard of your own life. Stand up, square your shoulders, and step into the light. The war is only over when you decide to stop surrendering. Take command of your peace, protect it fiercely, and never apologize for surviving the fire. As the dust settled on the Sterling family's shattered empire, one profound truth emerged from the wreckage. Blood might make you relatives, but it certainly does not make you family. For years, society conditions us to believe that we must endure toxic behavior, manipulation, and cruelty simply because it comes from our parents, our siblings, or our partners. We are told to keep the peace. We are told to forgive the unforgivable to keep the family unit intact. But true peace cannot exist in an environment where your fundamental human dignity is constantly put on trial. The protagonist of today's story didn't win her battle by screaming the loudest, or by sinking to the bitter level of her abusers. She won through the lethal, disciplined power of absolute silence and unwavering integrity. When you stop handing the narcissists in your life the emotional reactions they so desperately crave, you take back your power. When you realize that you do not need their permission to be successful, to be brave, or to be whole, their false authority over you evaporates completely. Your worth is not up for negotiation. If your family's table requires you to shrink yourself just to pull up a chair, it is time to walk away and build a new table. Stand tall in the reality of your own sacrifices. Whether your daily battlefield is a corporate boardroom, a courtroom, or the quiet confines of your own living room, never let anyone rewrite your history or diminish your light. The greatest revenge against those who tried to bury you in the dark is simply proving to them that you were the one who brought the fire. Protect your perimeter, love your chosen family fiercely, and always command your own destiny. This content was meticulously researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful insights and valuable life lessons.